Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide, and we're doing an emergency episode today, not just talking about all the elections around the world, but talking specifically about the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. More or less universally agreed to have been a bad night, shall we say, for Joe Biden. And we're going to be talking about this with two people well positioned to have not just instant considered reaction, if that isn't a contradiction in terms. With us in the London studio, Tim O'Brien, Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion and author of TrumpNation, The Art of Being the Donald. And joining us from Atlanta, where the debate was, running on, I'm sure, no sleep and coffee, and he says some fumes, Bloomberg reporter and the host of Bloomberg's Big Take podcast, David Gura. David, thank you in particular, because I know that you've had a long night. You were doing lots on Bloomberg television for us, and you've already put out an episode of the Big Take podcast on this, I guess for many Democrats, rather unhappy topic.
Mm-hmm. Great to be here.
So I know CNN, who were hosting the debate and broadcasting it, had a lot of constraints. So not only was it sort of unusual in having no audience, but I believe basically other reporters were not allowed in the room. So what was your experience in Atlanta?
Yes, the debate took place in a CNN studio in downtown Atlanta, and we, the reporters, were in the basketball arena at Georgia Tech. So not too far geographically from the site of the debate, but we weren't in the room itself. And so we sat around the concourse in this arena during the debate itself and watched it on a jumbotron in the middle, and there were TV screens all around the concourse as well. And on the floor, where the basketball court usually is, there was a red carpet, and leading up to the debate and afterward, that was transformed into this spin room, spin floor, and surrogates for each of the candidates came out and greeted reporters and fielded their questions. So I watched the debate unfold that way, and I think what stands out to me is how once the debate ended, there was an intense quiet in the arena. We made our way down to the floor, and then all of a sudden there was kind of a crush of Republican surrogates for Donald Trump who came onto the floor to field questions, holding up signs, and reporters flocked to them. But we had to wait a good 10 or 15 minutes before any Democrats came out. And finally we saw Governor Gavin Newsom of California, Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia. They stood together, reporters gathered around them. But it's clear that in those 10 or 15 minutes, in that vacuum, there must have been a lot of soul searching and a lot of effort that went into how to spin this in any positive light.
The mind boggles. I mean, when you sign up to be a surrogate and you know that it could go badly, but then you sort of feel like you almost become like an undertaker in the trying to talk about how Biden performed. I think many people listening to this will have either watched it in the US or around the world, or certainly seen some of the most damning clips. We're seeing a lot of commentators talking about this is the moment, the beginning of the end of the Biden presidency. I saw one person, many people calling for him to stand down. How serious do you sense that is among senior Democrats and in the White House? Or is that also a sort of moment of silence where people are still just trying to compute that it happened?
There were a lot of whispers about the president's capacity to serve a second term. I think that this has amplified those whispers. And you talk about senior Democrats. As I watched the response to this on television and saw surrogates and others in that arena last night, I noticed that a lot of graybeards in the party, establishment types who have been big backers of the Bidens, felt, I don't know if emboldened is the right word, but able to talk about the president's age and capacity in a way that they hadn't before. So I think that we're at a moment where the next 48 or 72 hours are going to be key in terms of how large that conversation gets, how all-encompassing it gets. And plenty of people have drawn the analogy to 1968 when LBJ addressed the nation and said that he wasn't going to seek a second term. I'll point out that happened in March of that year.
Exactly.
So the primaries were still very much underway. And I think the trickiness of this moment is Joe Biden has been the presumptive nominee now for such a long time. Yes, there have been some Democrats who have made these outsider runs to succeed him, but that hasn't happened. And so I think that the actual procedure by which that would happen is so unclear. It certainly colors and shapes the conversation that we're going to have here in the next few days.
Tim O'Brien.
Stephanie.
Are you, in your sort of bones, do you think that this will be the beginning of a process that sees Biden no longer the candidate? Or do we have to fall back to all the same reasons why we didn't think that was likely a few months ago or even 9 months ago?
Well, I think it raises the stakes, clearly. He's badly damaged by this debate. It's a monumental setback. He had one job in that debate, which was to convince voters he could stand shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump and display as much energy and an acute mind and an ability to defend some of the core policy issues that the Democrats are staking this campaign around. And he failed and failed and failed, and he failed spectacularly, to the extent that I think actually probably his own team wasn't fully prepared for how bad this would be. The reality of removing him or coaching him to remove himself or Biden himself willingly letting go is somewhat complex. He controls the delegates that have been pledged to him. Historically in the United States, conventions were venues in which there was real hashing out of who the nominee would be. And that stopped around 1960. I think JFK was the last presidential candidate who was in a convention where there was actual brokering going on the floor. So that's 64 years ago. And I think there's a possibility that this August we actually might have a brokered convention. And because certainly anybody in the party, I think with a sense of strategic wiliness and tactical import are back on their heels at a minimum. There's going to be a lot of polling to see how badly Biden is hemorrhaging support. And so then if the idea becomes he doesn't to rescue this bid for the Democrats and to staunch some of the, I think, unusual threats Donald Trump presents, how do you deal with that? There's first a small handful of people who would talk to Joe Biden, and the most important is his wife, Jill, and his sister, Valerie, who are easily his two closest advisors. And then there's a handful of White House professionals, Mike Donilon, chief among them, Ron Klain, and Anita Dunn. And they all would gradually have to say, it might be in the best interest of the party in this election for you to willingly release your delegates. If he says no, then it gets into kind of raw and interesting mud wrestling. And I don't think anyone has an idea of what that would look like. So there's that. If he does release his delegates and he does decide to step aside, there is not a clear person who's waiting in the wings to take on. I mean, obviously, Kamala Harris as vice president is an obvious go-to. There's not unified support for her for a number of reasons. On policy issues, she hasn't been as firm on her feet at certain moments as people would want. I also think the fact that she's a woman and a woman of color has weighed against her. So that if she wants this, she has to play for it. There's Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. They're all going to be in the wings. So there's both what will Biden do and then what happens if he does it. And all of that's up in the air.
I mean, he's certainly been quite stubborn to date. And if he was in denial about his mental state, then probably the only one who wasn't surprised by his performance last night may have been Joe Biden. But I remember Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist and obviously podcast host, he had pitched this whole thing, and I think he got a lot of blowback from others in the Democratic Party a few months ago, where he talked about actually this kind of scenario, that you would go a few months, things would not be getting better in the polls. He obviously didn't foresee a debate that was as catastrophic as last night. And the point he made was there had been a fear around an open convention and a sort of quote-unquote brawl, if it happens in a convention setting. But actually, for a set of voters who are quote-unquote double haters and are fed up with both candidates, very unenthusiastic, the people voting for Trump, many of them not enthusiastically doing so, unlike 2016. In that context, actually a lively fight for the candidacy in Chicago, where you have a number of credible candidates, could actually be a way to energize support for Democrats. David, do you think there's anything in that? Because we now seem to be a little bit closer to that scenario than we were.
I mean, something that stood out to me as I watched his surrogates yesterday is how young they all are compared to him. And so I mentioned Gavin Newsom coming out at the end of the debate, after the debate had concluded. He was on the floor before it, and he's a quarter of a century younger than Joe Biden. And
everybody's younger than Joe Biden.
Yeah. But we joked, who was enjoying this more than Gavin Newsom himself, just being out on the floor and greeting reporters and batting down these questions of, is he the backup candidate if something were to happen for Joe Biden? push that out of the way quite quickly.
And David, a quarter century younger, still makes him 56 because that's how old Joe Biden
exactly.
is. So.
Exactly. I think that we could have that. I think what's interesting, too, about Ezra Klein is that he wrote that column, got that blowback, and then he was one among many converts who saw the State of the Union address and thought that Joe Biden had pulled it off. And I think that fueled a lot of optimism about how this debate was going to go among those who had been skeptical about the president's performance in this debate. Going back to something that Tim said that I want to hit on is I think once I watched the debate start, I began to think that there was a bit of perhaps political malpractice. I mean, this is a debate that the Biden campaign wanted to have earlier than usual. Customarily, these debates don't happen until the parties have picked their nominees, and that didn't happen here. And I think Tim's hitting on something. Joe Biden, of course, has been a politician for a very long time and has a very close circle of allies and advisors. The shorthand for it is Biden world. And I think that there has to be some element of soul searching that's going to happen now about why didn't anyone speak up? Why didn't anyone sound the alarm about this? I mean, the drum of commentary heading into this debate from those people in particular and their friends on cable TV here in the United States has been, there's no way that he's going to botch this. The bar is low. He's definitely going to clear this bar. And if this was a real concern that he perhaps has good days and bad days, and there wasn't a guarantee that this was going to be a success like the State of the Union, they put him in a very tricky position. I mean, he may very well have wanted to be in that position, but one would think that there would have been more protection and they would have done more to prevent what happened yesterday from taking place.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because you do feel, among many other lots of sort of soul searching, it does go back to a judgment question, the judgment of his team, not only putting him up for this, but as you intimate, setting the terms of the debate, which in a way that even at the time seemed to oddly favor Donald Trump. You know, he was unpopular in past debates for having spoken over Joe Biden and for seeming like a bully. But if you silence the microphones, if you don't have any fact checking in real time from the hosts, that all these people, all these months who've said, no, really, he's fine. I mean, David, do you think that's also going to bounce back on senior Democrats who have insisted that he's absolutely on top of everything? Because it was very hard for many people to believe that watching him.
Yeah, I was struck especially by Claire McCaskill, the former senator who spoke immediately after this and just acknowledged the fact that he had this job to do and couldn't do it, as Tim laid out at the top. It didn't work, and the objective was fairly simple here. You look at how these two candidates prepared for this debate, and Joe Biden did it in a very traditional way. He absconded to Camp David outside of Washington, D.C., holed up with his advisors, did, as we understand it, a few rounds of mock debates to get ready for this. It was astonishing that yielded nothing in terms of canned lines that he might use to rankle Donald Trump or to emphasize how his policies are different or to underscore when Donald Trump was lying or bending the truth or, as happened, sort of completely obfuscating what happened with January the 6th and with the COVID-19 pandemic. There were such extremes here. And we knew going into this debate, we talk about the rules. I mean, I think that Dana Bash and Jake Tapper, the two CNN anchors who moderated it, said their job here wasn't to fact check it in real time. But absent that, it rested upon Joe Biden to do that. And I think that may have been one of the greatest failings of this, that Donald Trump spewed a lot of lies, which we're used to at this point. But Joe Biden did nothing in the face of that to acknowledge or emphasize the fact that these were all untruths.
Yeah, I guess that was one other conclusion you could draw, that actually lots of other people could have beaten Donald Trump, that he would not have been hard to beat in that debate, just he was extremely hard to beat by Joe Biden.
Right. I don't think he was perceived as a convicted felon and someone who had been found guilty of sexual assault and twice impeached and fomented an insurrection. He came off as an energetic frat boy, ready to get into a bar fight. And at the moments on the debate screen where he was perplexed by Biden's ineptitude, he looked like an avatar for everyone watching the show who was also confused by Biden's inability to land a blow. And David raised this good point about, the prep lines and the policy lines that didn't come up. I almost think it is definitely that, as David pointed out, and it's even worse because I think at a couple of moments he tried to.
Yes.
And either his responses meandered into sort of, oh, grandpa's walking around in the woods late at night in his pajamas, or he mangled the point of the line. And it was painful to watch. And sometimes when Trump was giving an answer, they'd have a side-by-side on the TV screen. And
that's
Biden,
the other point. You think, how would you have allowed the side-by-side?
Yeah, and Biden is slack-jawed or he's looking off vacant. and you sort of want to put a warm blanket around his shoulders and lead him off stage. And that's, that TV is a visual medium. And in a debate, famously Richard Nixon was sweating because he had a fever and he hadn't really shaved. And people who listened to the Kennedy-Nixon debate on the radio thought Nixon had won. People watching on TV were like, this guy looks like he's an unhealthy thug, and why would we vote for him? And
it's a delicious thing, just to interject, because Mark Thompson, the head of CNN ahead of this, said he wanted this debate to harken back to that, Tim. He wanted to have this kind of spare, slimmed down version of the debate. And so to have that element of a candidate who, yes, was ailing. I mean, that's what we heard sort of minutes into this debate, that Joe Biden had a cold and that was what was causing all of this. It's a delicious parallel that you're bringing up there.
And, one of the clips I think that went viral, or one of the moments that went viral, was when he tried to explain how the administration and Democrats had bulked up Medicaid and had delivered better health care to Americans. And there was a long pause where he didn't talk. And he ended up, as was well known now, saying, we killed Medicaid. It happened on immigration. It happened on abortion. It happened on the economy and inflation, all the touch points. And it was just very painful to watch because Joe Biden in 2020 beat Donald Trump twice in debates and owned him. And so this obviously is a much more, I think, addled and challenged person this time around, who's been a great public servant, but maybe a year ago should have said, the best thing I can do right now, I've gotten us through this first term and into a new place, so I'm going to step aside for a new generation of Democrats. And he could have owned the narrative at that point, and now the narrative owns him.
I'm going to let you go in 1 second, but David, to go back to where we started, insofar as it's possible to say, what is your sense in terms of the critical mass of senior Democrats and the likelihood of them approaching Joe Biden? Or is this all going to be in the hands of whether he accepts some kind of reality or decides to stand down over the next few days?
I'm very curious what the conversations are going to be like among those senior Democrats and the degree to which his campaign and Biden world, as I mentioned, push back on all of this. Kate Bedingfield, his longtime aide and former communications advisor, was on CNN last night, and I was struck by how frank she was in her assessment of this debate as well. I don't think she's quite at the point where she's saying that he shouldn't run or he should step aside. But I'll be looking for any indications that there are movements in that firmament, that the ground on which he is standing is changing. And I'll go back to what I said. I think that the whispers have changed to a wider, broader conversation about his fitness and capacity for the job. And I just want to see sort of how much traction that gets among senior Democrats, as you say, just among policymakers more broadly.
And they're supposed to be out on the stump today campaigning, and I guess potentially through the weekend. I mean, is there any sense, even just looking at it last night, you didn't feel that Biden was necessarily up to that?
Yeah, so he went to this Waffle House restaurant for an early breakfast before he caught a flight to Raleigh, and he actually seemed markedly better and more animated at that restaurant. But yeah, he goes to Raleigh, North Carolina, which is this battleground state where I'm from, and he's supposed to campaign there today. And then this weekend, he has a series of kind of high dollar fundraising events, one in the Hamptons and I think a couple in New Jersey as well. So it's quite possible that at those events, he may address this or be asked about this. Customarily, we don't get transcripts of the back and forth between donors and the president, but we do get a transcript of what he says at the top, and we'll read that.
And it feels like epically bad judgment to send someone who's flubbed a debate to a Waffle House. The next day, it's like having Rishi Sunak in front of number 10 in the middle of the rain.
Or visiting Titanic.
Like, how hard are some of these atmospherics to master?
Well, this goes back to the malpractice. And Tim, do you think what's the chance that they're going to be telling those donors are going to be telling him the truth? Because there don't seem to have been a lot of people telling him the truth. If last night it is more than just a bad night, if it really does speak to his demeanor day to day.
I do think he even surprised his own handlers. I think people who had the State of the Union in mind, and even some of his other campaign stops where he looked stiff but was verbally acute. And I could be wrong, but I don't think anybody would have put him on the stage anticipating, that you'd end up like with Quasimodo there. And so I think there's going to be people, the donors have every reason to be frank. But again, it's going to, like, the person who's going to be very important right now is Jill Biden, his wife.
And whoever lets him read the newspapers.
Yes.
Or doesn't.
Or watch TV.
David Gura, Tim O'Brien, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this special crash episode of Voternomics from Bloomberg. It was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, and produced by Summer Sadi with help from Chris Martlew. Additional editing and sound design by Blake Maples. Brendan Francis Noonan is our executive producer, and Sage Bowman is head of Bloomberg Podcasts, with special thanks to Tim O'Brien and David Gura. Please do subscribe, rate, and review the show fondly wherever you listen to podcasts.